So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carolyn Deer-Burback, and I'm the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and SDGs. So on behalf of my colleagues, I welcome you all to this virtual roundtable on fostering access to and transfer of environmental technologies, with a focus on trade-related policies and incentives. So this roundtable is part of a dialogue series that we're hosting at TESS on climate, trade, and sustainable development, focused on multilateral perspectives. So we're really delighted that so many of you can join us today from around the world, and also grateful to our excellent group of speakers. So before turning to them, I wanted to take just a few minutes to set the scene. So we're here today because there's a renewed interest and urgency in debate on how to foster access to and transfer of environmental technologies. As governments are confronted with multiple environmental crises of climate, nature loss, and pollution, alongside pressing sustainable development priorities, we know that a rapid transformation to a more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient global economy will require a massive scaling up, diffusion, and transfer of key technologies, key environmental technologies. So while tech transfer has been a recurring debate in international policy making for several decades, it's really gained renewed urgency and policy relevance in light of the importance of environmental technologies to solving shared global environmental challenges. And across the world, there are calls for various forms of government intervention to increase environmental technology access, transfer, absorption, and also adaptation to local circumstances. So importantly, this environmental dimension of the current discussion somewhat changes the rationale for action on technology transfer, moving from what sometimes been perceived as a zero-sum game, including one touched by lots of concern around empowering potential competitors. And now we have a common imperative linked to preserving global public goods and addressing global challenges. So the starting point for our discussion today is that we have this shared collective interest in boosting levels of environmental technology access, diffusion and uptake, and also technological development in developing countries and LDCs. Now, the creation of a dedicated technology mechanism linked to the UNFCCC, for instance, recognizes this recognition of the importance of tech transfer to achieving rapid decarbonization and also climate resilience. But here today, we're going to focus on the role of trade, the role and relevance of trade and trade policies to this discussion on tech transfer. And this comes amidst renewed interest in how trade and trade policies are relevant to helping us solve environmental challenges in the context of wider sustainable development goals. So there have been long-standing discussions in a range of WTO regular committees on these issues, but there's also renewed interest in this in the context of new joint initiatives on environment and sustainable development at the WTO. So the recent ministerial statement on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade specifically mentions the issue of technology transfer. The statement on trade and environmental sustainability highlights the relevance of trade and trade policies to promoting access to and uptake of environmental technologies. So here today, our goal is to explore some of these trade-related policies and incentives and to see where governments could go in this space. So our first speaker today will start by reviewing some of the existing technology needs with a particular focus on climate change mitigation and adaptation technology needs. We'll then discuss initiatives in developing countries to access critical environmental technologies and to establish regional value chains, including in the context of regional integration processes such as the AFCFTA. And finally, we're going to look at some concrete options, international cooperation in the design and implementation of trade and investment-related policies to foster access to and transfer of technologies. And after all of that, we'll have time for an open discussion and a Q&A. We invite you all to make comments, to post questions in the chat. You can post materials that you have that are relevant to this discussion, and we will be sure to circulate that as part of our meeting report. We'll also be able to take questions from the floor at the end and give the speakers a chance to respond to one another. And the final thing is this session is being recorded, so it will be available for you to share with colleagues and others afterward. So to move straight on to our first speaker, who's going to look at this overview of countries' priorities and needs we are going to turn to Rajiv Garg, who is the Regional Manager for Africa and Central Asia at the UN Climate Technology Center and Network, CTCN for short, which is part of the UNFCCC technology mechanism. We're really delighted to have Rajiv join us. He has almost 30 years experience on these issues of climate technologies in developing countries, including work for 15 years in the Indian government. So really delighted to have you share your expertise with us today. Rajiv, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you, Caroline, for inviting me and for giving a brief introduction, my brief introduction and introducing me to colleagues and participants. Very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on from where you are attending this meeting. I work with the Climate Technology Center and Network. And this Climate Technology Center and Network, it is hosted by UNEP, but it has been established under the UNFCCC framework of the technology mechanism. Do you see my slides? Do you see my next slide?
Not yet. I think, Deepa, it may be better, maybe if slides.
Okay, here it comes.
Voila. Okay, great.
Great. So, the developing countries specifically have been asking for support on climate technologies. And this support on climate means they have been asking for support on climate technologies, capacities, and financing. And in order to meet this demand and this request from the developing countries after a series of negotiations, this technology mechanism was established by the UNFCCC as after discussions and negotiations in the climate COP. The CTCN is a kind of an implementation arm of the technology mechanism. The mandate of the CTCN is to provide technical assistance and support to the developing countries on their demand. The CTCN operates, as of now, CTCN has more, first of all, CTCN just works only in the developing countries. It has, it works in the countries through a primary focal point, which is also known as nationally designated entities. And we received the request for technical assistance on a number of subjects or a number of issues on climate change from these focal points. These are the kind of 3 service areas of the CTCN. Means we provide technical assistance, we support countries through collaboration and networking, and we also do provide knowledge exchange and knowledge products. All of these are on our website through a knowledge management system. We work both on climate change mitigation and adaptation issues with the objective of reducing the GHG emissions and also strengthening climate resilience. And these are the various sectors, as you can see on the slide. We work on agriculture, carbon fixation and abatement, energy efficiency, forestry, industry, renewable energy, transport, and waste management are some of the sectors we work under mitigation. And on the adaptation, we work on agriculture, forestry, coastal issues, early warning systems, human health, urban planning, and water. But these are just representative. They are not the final list. Finally, it depends on what the countries want. Means they are free to ask for support. Till now, after establishment and operationalization as early in 2014, CTCN has received more than 330 30 requests for technical assistance from 108 countries. The maximum we have received are from Africa. Africa is the largest portfolio with more than 45% of the requests which we have received from there. If we look at the sectoral distribution of the kind of requests or the kind of technologies which the countries are looking at, you can see it on the screen. But before I go into the kind of technologies and the focus area which the countries look at, let me try to define a definition for technology. What do we mean by technology? And I would be quoting or referring to the IPCC definition of technology. In IPCC, when you define a technology, it is not just a hardware or a piece of an equipment or a piece of an instrument, but technology more is also, the software part of it. And when I say the software part of it, how do you adapt that technology to suit your conditions? How do you maintain the technology? What knowledge skills are required to scale up the technology? What are the policies and enabling environment which are required to scale up the technologies? So forth and so on. So technology is not just in hardware, but also a kind of a software. But more importantly, what also has been defined as technology is the institutions or the organizations in the country which supports uptake of technology, which supports transfer of technology, which supports scaling up of technology. And a combination of all these three things constitutes a technology. So basically what we have received from the countries is support, them seeking support on energy efficiency and renewable energy and waste management on the mitigation sectors. These are the three large, and these are the requests which have come to the CTCN. And on the adaptation side, we have received requests related to water management, water planning, agriculture and forestry, and definitely early warning systems. What has also happened is that CTCN is the implementation arm of the technology mechanism, but at the same time, there is another arm, which is the policy arm, which is called as Technology Executive Committee. And we two work together. You all know that the countries were asked to submit their revised nationally determined contributions. Some of the countries have also undertaken as a technology need assessment, and a report was published which analyzes the nationally determined contribution which were received as of 31st December 2022. This report is available at the following website. What we found in this analysis that more than 90% of the NDCs which the countries have submitted, there was a reference to technology, that there is a need, that they want some kind of technology. 93% included only qualitative information on the technology aspects, while 37% also included quantitative information, means they broke down the technology requirements, the technology need, and they identified the kind of technology which is required, the kind of impacts which is going to have, the kind of GHG emission reduction which they foresee from these efforts. Also, it is worthwhile to note that when we were doing this analysis, we found that there was a great interest on technology innovation, research, and development. Definitely the other aspects of having built capacity to identify technology needs or specific technology to be deployed, or policy or regulatory and regulatory environment to be built up, or any other legal aspects were demanded or were mentioned. But there was also an important component of technology innovation, research, and development, which we didn't find in the earlier cases, but now the interest of the parties have started growing in that direction. We also did an analysis of the technology need assessment. Now, a countries have been undertaking technology need assessments since 2010. Some of the countries, they have undertaken 2 or 3 or 4 technology need assessment on a continual basis because the technology landscape keeps on changing. They need to keep on updating their technology need assessment. In the adaptation sector, and specifically for Africa, water and agriculture sector are the highest in demand, means countries have identified technologies in the water and the agriculture sector the most in Africa. And this is very understandable. It's more of an agro-based economy. Agriculture is the prime, source of earning of the people, and therefore there's a huge climate impact on agriculture as well as water, and these two are very closely linked. But even in the water sector, means water storage and harvesting is one thing which has been identified most in the technology need assessment, stating that this is of the highest priority. Water management is the highest priority. Water catchment and harvesting, desalination of salt water, monitoring and modeling, water saving technologies, so forth and so on. But the highest, or the technology or the focus area where there was a maximum demand, or which was prioritized by most of the countries, is water storage, harvesting and management. Again, coming to the agriculture side, farming systems and crop management has been very high in priority. And this is quite very understandable, because if you look at the crop management, it also includes the post-harvest crop processing. And there have been reports which suggest that up to 45%, in some cases up to 45% of the crop is lost because of bad management practices, because it cannot reach the market at the right time, because there is no storage facility, because it cannot be dried, because there are poor practices in drying, so forth, and and number of reasons. Because of the impact of the climate change, we also found that as a part of their need assessment, crop diversification or new varieties of crops are being in demand. Those which are resilient to drought, or those which are resilient to salination, drip irrigation and soil management. Again, drip irrigation is can be seen more from the point of view of water management and efficient water use. So this is also quite high in the priority of the countries. If we look at the mitigation sectors, definitely in the mitigation sector, energy, LULUCF, and forestry are of the highest, but energy is outscoring everyone. Means there is a need. There's a need of energy excess. Means there are countries where in only 30 to 33% or 35% of the population have access to energy. Therefore, energy is very high in demand, and also energy is required for any socioeconomic growth in a country. And to that effect, we can see that in the TNAs, countries have prioritized the use of solar energy, specifically solar PV, that to standalone or non-grid connected solar energy. Hydropower Africa, in some of the countries, there's a great potential of small-scale hydropower plants, micro hydropower plants, micro turbines. So that is also has been prioritized. Surprisingly, bioenergy is there, but we look at bioenergy more from the point of view of energy which can be derived from forest and forest related products like briquetting and things like that. And in that sense, there was a number of countries have prioritized cooking stoves or clean cooking methods at a very high level. Definitely buildings and lighting systems, cogeneration, wind energy, waste energy also have some mention in the analysis which we did. Well, final two slides, what we see and what has come out of the technology need assessment reports analysis and analysis of the NDCs, lack of data availability to implement technologies in an informed manner is the biggest challenge by the countries. First of all, they are not able to identify the technology. Even if they are able to identify the technology, they are not able to adapt the technology so that it can be used very efficiently in countries. What we also found that economic and social viability of the technology is very crucial. The other thing is that it cannot have been, means it cannot have a one size fit all approach. Means it has to be tailor made to specific requirements. Regulation and governance is a big issue. Sometimes there is not sufficient monitoring systems, and therefore the kind of impact it is making is not known. Countries do not have clear policies on climate change, and even if there are policies, they keep on changing. So there is not long-term, there is no long-term policy or long-term action, and this kind of inhibits the private sector to come into the country. First, because the policies are not consistent, the market size is very small, and as CTCN, we are trying to do a kind of harmonization of the policies, at least at a sub-regional level, so that you can have a bigger market in the region or sub-region, and in order to create the bigger market, definitely the question of technology flows and the trade and other policy issues would come into picture. Financing definitely is a challenge. There is some financing available, but how to access this financing is the more important question, which the countries are not able to answer. Well, we have challenges, but these also provides us with the opportunity. And this opportunity is, countries have started prioritizing exactly what they want through the TNAs and the NDCs, which are being carried out. They have and since they are able to identify the technologies, now they have started looking at how to fund them, how to scale them up, and therefore they have started getting more clarity on the funding gaps. What funding, what external funding do they require? How much they can bring it through their own national budgets, etc. So there have been some kind of more clarity on this, and definitely this all provides, there are various mechanisms, the technology mechanism like the CTCN is there. There's a financial mechanism which comprises of the GCF. There are other institutions, financial institutions, which are available, and this provides a kind of a platform wherein collaboration and networking can happen so that these challenges can be met in a more holistic manner. There is a big push to engage the private sector, and there are various challenge programs, various innovative ideas, national systems of innovations, which are being drafted into the framework, into the country's framework as policies, so as to enable scale up of these technologies. So there are lots of collaboration and engagement opportunities which are coming up because of this. I think that is the end of my presentation. I have been able to highlight what technology prioritization or what technology priorities have been done by the countries, and some of the challenges and opportunities. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rashid. A really super useful presentation. I think it's really useful to see such concrete analysis of how technology features in the NDCs and NAPs that the governments are developing, and also the very specific emphasis on the range of needs across a whole set of different sectors, based on what kind of specific challenges that governments are seeking to address. So I think that what your presentation really underlines is this technology aspect, and technology transfer aspect is really significant for countries, particularly in the African region, for achieving climate goals on mitigation and adaptation. And I would say it's also brilliant to have a representative of the climate governance regime, the UNFCCC in particular, participating in this discussion. It really helps us to ground and enrich our discussion on climate and trade, including on technology transfer aspects. So there's much that could be said, but I will hold off and just thank you again for your contribution, and now shift to our next speaker, who is Professor Faisal Ismail. He's the director of the new Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance in South Africa. And he served as the ambassador and permanent representative of South Africa to the WTO here in Geneva in the past. He still works closely as the chair of the International Trade Administration Committee in South Africa, and has a number of publications on issues of trade and sustainable development at the WTO and in the African region. So Professor Ismail is going to speak to us about experiences from developing countries in promoting access to environmentally sound technologies and in terms of developing their own regional productive capacities. So Professor Ismail, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Well, it's such a pleasure to be back in Geneva, even though virtually. I spent a lot of time there in my younger life when I had more black hair. So thanks to Caroline and to Christophe for this invitation to join this fabulous discussion, really, that you have initiated in Geneva. I myself, I'm not an expert on climate change, but I'm learning fast. So thanks very much to Rajiv for that technology transfer. Because right now, we are thinking a lot about climate change and how to think about it. So really what I'm going to share with you is my own thoughts and my colleagues here at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance about how to think about, how we're thinking about it and how we're engaging with this very challenging crisis in the world. So I am, as I've said to you, a trade negotiator. So you'll see as I speak that a lot of that experience will be reflected in the way I think. Our school is a public policy school here in Cape Town, but focused on the continent. So as I do talk to you, you'll see also that perspective of the African continent. So my topic, I was thinking about this, the topic for the discussion, which is about technology. So I'm really interpreting it very broadly, and I'm asking the question, how can Africa's trading partners facilitate its strategic path towards what I call climate resilient development and green industrialization? So I'm going to start by saying a few things about climate change, and then talk a little bit about the national context. What are we doing? What should we be doing at the national level? And then talk a bit about the region, our South-South relations bilaterally, and then multilaterally. So as you know, well, I don't need to make these points, that climate change is creating significant, not just risks, but real disasters across the world. But we're seeing this vividly on the African continent. And just last week, in fact, here in South Africa on the East Coast, I'm safely in Cape Town, but where my mom lives in Durban, in the KwaZulu-Natal area, we've had a devastating floods. You may have seen that on the news. Just 48 hours of floods left, over 440 people killed by the floods, and thousands displaced, and over 630 schools damaged, hospitals and clinics as well. So climate change is here. So what do we need to do? How do we respond to this reality that we're all living in and these massive risks that are the IPCC has been warning us about all these years? Well, I think in the first instance, we need to recognize the critical importance of this systemic challenge, and developing countries must mainstream climate change into their national development strategies. So what that means is everything we do at the national level, trying to achieve the goals, for example, of sustainable development, Agenda 2633, as you know, is the African program for transformation on the African continent. Well, we have to now bring in climate change if we haven't already, and we have to make it, we have to what I call mainstream it. It has to become, diffused into all our development strategies. And I found a nice concept actually in AR6 in the latest IPCC documents, which speaks about climate resilient development, which really means the same thing, mainstreaming development or mainstreaming climate change in development. And so we have to ensure that our climate resilient development strategies facilitate adaptation, because I think, as Rajiv pointed out, climate change is impacting a wide range of sectors, from agriculture, transport, the water, energy, and just a long list of things that he did mention. So we have to see how we can make each of those sectors more resilient. So for example, the roads, they just, the floods in Durban just knocked them all off because they were not sufficiently resilient, and thousands of houses just were washed away because we clearly didn't plan properly. So we have to make our planning more resilient. Of course, at the national level, you've got to make sure that we include everyone, it's participatory, and we've got to make sure that the way in which we transition, the way we change to lower carbon ensures there's a just transition. We take everyone with us, we don't leave anyone behind. Now, I think that instead of just looking to everybody else to solve our problems, we must take responsibility. So African countries must have agency. We must make sure that we know what we want, what's our climate resilient development strategy, and we need to engage with different players across the world, starting with ourselves at the regional level, and I'll say a few words about that, and then our partners in the South, what we can do with them, and then of course at the global level, both in the UNFCCC and other UN institutions, and then of course in the WTO, where there is a debate going on about climate change. So very exciting development at the regional level. I myself am very actively involved in this, both as my former experience as a trade negotiator, but now we're working with the Secretariat. As you know, African countries have come together, 55 member states, and we're creating a single market. But we want to do this in a way, we want to regionalize, we want to build regional integration in a way which is developmental, which benefits everyone, which doesn't simply, benefit the larger economies and marginalize the smaller ones, like we've seen in Europe and in other parts of the world. So we've come up with the concept of developmental regionalism. So including in the process of trade liberalization, industrialization and regional value chains, cross-border infrastructure, and cooperation with each other on sectoral issues, including on climate change. So we have a great opportunity in Africa to leverage this continental market to attract investment, because now you have a huge market, investors should come, and because it's it's profitable for them and sensible for them to come and invest and in the process help African countries to industrialize, transferring technology, both through investment, but also through cooperation. And crucially, as I think Rajiv has pointed out, the most important sector number one, I think, for African countries is to improve their infrastructure and energy, because the level of access to energy ranges from 11%, for example, in Malawi, to, of course, some countries like Mauritius and the Seychelles, where there's 100%, but on average, just over 40% of African countries have access to energy. So in a number of sectors, there are opportunities for African countries to industrialize, but in a way which already integrates green technologies and recognizes the new markets, the new consumer demand that in Europe and the United States, for example, 2035, the Europeans have said, at least the OEMs, they're not going to import cars with combustion engines. If we don't have, electric vehicles and electric batteries, so we have to, it means if we produce cars like we do in South Africa, we have to transition to the new technologies. So how then do we also work together with other countries? So countries like China, India, Brazil, and a number of others are making progress, innovating. How can we support each other? There should be a lower threshold for technology transfer, South-South cooperation, sharing experiences. How are we doing the just transition? So for example, South Africa, we have to make a massive change from coal and fossil-based fuel energy. So all our energy is, almost all of it is produced with coal, but we have to transition and we have to make sure that we do it in a way which is sensitive to the poor, to the workers, to the communities. How do we share that experience with others in other countries and learn from each other? In some cases, developing countries have capacity in finance, also in infrastructure development. Let's share those experiences. And how can we work together to engage with the North, in multilateral fora? Now, of course, the first place is, I think, climate first. I know when I was in Geneva for many years, Pascal Lamy used to always say climate first. And I think that's correct. The guideline for how we engage on trade and other issues should come from the discourse on climate change and the negotiations on climate change in the UNFCCC. So that's where we really need to focus on how we approach climate change issues. And of course, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, that is a starting point, that recognizing the differences between developed and developing countries. Each has a different responsibility. We all have to work together, but we each have different responsibilities. There have been many offers made, Copenhagen, and since then, by developed countries, commitments to contribute development finance, about $100 billion per year. That was the number that was being talked about for a number of years. But to my knowledge, thus far, we haven't really met that. And of course, the numbers are growing. So all the estimates now are that we need at least $750 billion. And I can see why, just looking at the damage that was caused recently here in South Africa by floods. So we will have to make, we'll have to raise those funds. Those that have the resources must contribute to that, because we are in this as a common effort. There could be a specific fund on trade and environment with the, at the initiative of the UNFCCC, working with others, including the WTO, looking at the specific, technologies, the green technologies that could help developing countries, whether that's simple stuff like solar panels, but to more complex technologies in, say, battery storage and issues like that. So how to help countries in the developing world and in Africa to transition and to acquire those technologies. So in the WTO, what do we do? Well, things have not been going as well. Since I left, we were already in crisis in Geneva. That crisis has worsened, and even the basic concept of special and differential treatment, which was negotiated, which took many years to come into being, is now being questioned. But of course, that principle of differential treatment is a right. It was negotiated in the Uruguay round, and it has to be the bedrock of the way forward. There are discussions going on in the WTO about environmental goods and services for a number of years. But again, developing countries and developed countries are very divided on it. And part of the problem is these discussions have moved into small groups. But of course, if they are going to be inclusive, they must be multilateral in nature. We have to have real engagement and find win-win solutions. There are countries, especially the EU and others, who are trying to put in place carbon adjustment mechanisms and taxes at the border. And as you know, these are unilateral measures. In many cases, they will be very coercive because it means that countries in the developing world will have to meet them if they're going to get their goods in. It means that it'll raise the cost of production and reduce the competitiveness of developing countries. And of course, it'll make it more difficult for them to meet their climate resilient development strategies. So we have to find a way to rethink that and see how we could rather focus on measures to help the developing countries to create the policy space to improve their competitiveness and to address their challenges, the climate resilient development strategies. And then fourthly, of course, the big issue of technology transfer. There are commitments in the WTO that haven't been met for LDCs, for example, but we are going to need a much bigger effort to transfer technology across a wide range of technologies in all these new technologies that are emerging, that are possible solutions that could support green industrialization, renewable energy. And for that, I think we're going to need a huge flexibility on the existing TRIPS agreement, something like the discussion going on at the moment in the WTO on a waiver, a climate waiver, maybe time limited, maybe with a peace clause, so that there are no disputes. So that's my very quick 10-minute overview. I hope I managed to do it in 10 minutes of what we're thinking about, or how to think about how to address climate change and technology transfer. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Faisal. And for someone who started by saying he hadn't been thinking too much about climate, I think that your presentation has been really super in setting out a perspective from the African region, and also with your tremendous experience in the WTO context. I think it's really helped set us up. I think what's really important is you underline the urgency of this issue for African countries themselves in terms of environment, social and economic impacts and risks. Also underlining this point about the just transition. I think we can all think harder with you on this climate resilient development concept. I think that's a really useful one for all of us. And then without wanting to summarize your excellent presentation, I think the key thing that I appreciate from you is that there's work to do at home in the region. There's work to be done with other developing countries. That at the global level, we should really start with the climate regime, with the climate goals and the principles that it has, including CBDR as a really fundamental one for developing countries. And it's through that lens that we should look at trade policy issues. So thank you very much for setting out in your last slide some of the multilateral ideas that you have, all very concrete. Without anything more from me, I think it's a wonderful segue to our next speaker, Silvia, who's going to talk to us a little more about options for international cooperation on trade-related policies and incentives around technology transfer for environmental technologies. So Silvia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And hi, everybody. Thanks for showing up. And thanks also to the previous speakers for the really interesting participation, their really interesting contributions. I will try to not repeat too much of what they said. And I found it really interesting as well to listen. So just so you guys know, this is based on some research that I've been doing, a paper that's going to be coming out soon, an academic paper about low carbon technology diffusion and transfer. And I'll touch also on national actions and international cooperation. So as we heard before, technology doesn't only refer to some hardware. It's important to understand technology and technology transfer as made up of both hardware and software. And so technology transfer, when we talk about it, what we really mean is being able to use the technology, but also to adapt the technology, integrate it with different systems, make it work locally. And the reason that technology transfer is so important in the climate negotiations in just in general is also because of the local knowledge and skills increases and the associated development potential benefits, also the fact that this is a much more sustainable way to reduce emissions in the long term. And so the other speakers have also touched upon the importance of closing this low carbon technology gap, basically that the ownership of intellectual property rights and also the highest value activities in the low carbon technology value chain are often concentrated in OECD countries, also in China now. And of course, this comes with some pretty significant issues as regards historical justice, historical responsibility for the causes of climate change. And we know this because there's also these obligations to encourage tech transfer to developing countries in the Paris Agreement, also the TRIPS. And so the point is to look at, is this actually happening? Where is it happening? Why isn't it happening? And so I've looked a bit in the academic literature, these case studies about technology transfer, and what they tell us is basically, for example, I mostly look at energy value chains, but for other technologies as well, we kind of see similar patterns, that there's this first mover advantage, in this case from the EU. China is usually a big success story in the literature. It has become a leader in manufacturing technologies and installing technologies, but also in research and development, which is this crucial and very high value segment of value chains. And many other developing countries use technologies, but don't necessarily produce them, don't necessarily have the tech transfer. And so here, I think it's important to have a look at the different actors in technology transfer. And so basically, you can imagine this as one firm who's a technology supplier, and they have all of these different capacities. They have the goods, the services, the designs, they have the skills and know-how, knowledge and expertise. And depending on what is transferred to somebody who is importing it, there's either the option of new production capacities being made, but there's also the accumulation of technological capacity. And this is the one that everybody wants. This is the tech transfer and the thing that allows us to have this sustainable development, this green industrialization that's such an important goal. So I'm just breaking this down into flows, and I'm talking today about Jordan because that's where I did some research, but I think it applies in a lot of different contexts. So the first way that we might see technology transfer happening is what we call flow A. And basically, this is in fact a little different. It's only technology diffusion. In some cases, a company will come in, build and operate a wind farm. And of course, there are benefits for the technology importer in that they have some sustainable power in their country, which is not always a bad thing, right? This mostly is going to happen in relatively large, relatively attractive markets where a firm can feel guaranteed that they'll get some profits. So for the importer, there are obviously the new energy source benefits. There's also the rents from the land use, but these can sometimes be kind of low. This was the case at the wind farm in Jordan that I was looking at. There's also some jobs that are created through technology diffusion. But it's not always the kinds of jobs that governments are prioritizing, right? Because it could be construction, could be security and cleaning, but it's not the kind of operation and maintenance that are these more high skill, high paid jobs. And this can also eventually sometimes lead to failure and backlash locally against these projects. So who's left out of this flow? Well, usually those environments that are seen as a relatively risky investment environment, not so attractive market, one with lower demand or infrastructure problems, potentially also with weaker property rights protections. And this is, as hinted at before, also one of the reasons that we see a lot of energy investment going to Europe, the US, BRICS countries, but much less to very small developing countries. Some potential ways to address this very important gap, which are already happening, are de-risking and demand aggregation. So that would also be part of this regional development that's been hinted at too. Improving infrastructure is very important here. But of course, this isn't usually something that's actually addressed by markets. This is something that is addressed by different international mechanisms and governments who have the money and the ability to sort of absorb risks in a different way that when their private sector won't. So another way that we can see technology transfer happening, what we call flow B, would be if a country built a wind farm, if a company, sorry, built a wind farm, and then it would hire locals to operate and maintain it. And so this generally is going to happen if locals have sufficient skills for some kind of operation and maintenance. It also happens more often where firms see a relatively low risk of losing control of value creation. And so for the technology supplier, they get new markets, they get new profits. For the importer, they have this ability to integrate new energy sources into a system and also higher skilled jobs, which is a good development benefit. But who's left out of flow B? Countries with relatively lower skilled workers, and also according to the literature, although this is sometimes disputed, countries that have relatively low international property rights protections rankings. So one way to increase this tech transfer flow would be training and capacity building programs, maybe policy changes, so requiring training and employment if there's going to be a new project built, potentially also increasing IPR protections. Finally, flow C, and this is the good stuff. Here's the real tech transfer and how we get green development. This isn't occurring in Jordan, so I'll switch to the example of China, which is the one that people I think already know, where we have a very high flow of knowledge and expertise, not only hardware. And so local firms are able to accumulate this technological capacity. They're able to adapt it, and they're eventually able to invent new things, export them. And this is possible because they're involved in these processes that require the knowledge and expertise. So in China, for the solar PV sector, this was manufacturing solar panels. And the reason is partly because of government requirements. So for example, local content requirements. And this also has to be of advantage to the firm because there's a risk associated with losing control of knowledge and expertise. So the technology supplier, if they eventually allow technology transfer to happen, could lose their market share because there are new competitors coming in. For the technology importer, of course, this is great news because of the technological capacity, the possibility to develop new industries. The problem is some of these policies that are used to increase technology transfer, especially local content requirements, they have a high potential to backfire, which is also what some of the literature on trade conflicts suggests, and also that it makes it a less attractive environment for investment. So some policies that have been used in the past to quote unquote force tech transfer, I'm using this term, but it's questionable in some cases because companies obviously choose where they operate based on costs and benefits, right? So it's not really forced, it's just promoted maybe. So one way that this happened in China is that there's this requirement for joint ventures. So if a foreign firm wants to operate in China, it has to form a legal relationship. And there's a strategic list of technologies that this applies to. Solar and wind used to be on this list. Electric vehicles were too until 2022. There's also local content requirements. These are quite common around the world. It just means that developers have to use a certain percentage of local products. So if you're making a solar farm in Jordan, maybe a local content requirement would be you have to use 50% local labor constructing it, something. And it's quite common, it's often tied to funding eligibility. The problem with local content requirements, because the point of them is to build industry, but it doesn't always work, unfortunately. This is from the case of India, a paper that looks at local content rules. It doesn't always work to increase domestic manufacturing capacity. It can also make installations a bit more expensive depending on how developed the local industry is and actually what the local content would be. And it's also led to some trade conflicts, especially between the US, EU, and China. This kind of relates to the debate on fostering tech transfer. And here I'm breaking it down into some sort of pro and con positions. Obviously, it's more nuanced than this, but just to get an overview, because I saw also in the chat that somebody wanted to know about IPRs, so here it is. That there's basically some different goals that can eventually come into conflict. So if the goal is to diffuse existing technology as quickly as possible, technology holders often promote these investments in innovation, which are protected by property rights, and they see this as driving technological advances for all. And they say that countries should have strict IPR protections because this makes them more attractive for investment. And so technology importers can often argue that, of course, it's important to enable these clean development pathways to enable green industrialization, and IPRs are blocking this. There is a risk of patent thickets. So basically that there's a lot of patents needed to innovate on a certain technology. It's too expensive and it's too legally complicated. So a firm that might otherwise have been able to make a new solar inverter was not able to because of IPRs. That's one way that they're seen as a problem. But there's also this moral element to it, right? That IPRs allow a firm to monopolize a knowledge that can be life-saving. And I think a lot of us in this meeting would agree that climate change is pretty life-threatening issue. And also there's the north-south imbalances that I talked about earlier, where basically a lot of the value is flowing back to those firms that own IPRs, which are usually located in countries that have higher responsibility and lower risks. So some proposed solutions to this from either side basically are the importance of making patents affordable and making them also flexible, so having important exceptions. And also there's been some work on patent pledges. This hasn't really panned out though. And there's also a drive from technology importers largely to have waivers to the TRIPS agreement, licensing exceptions, and to put important technologies into the public domain. So I just want to say briefly, because we've heard from the other presenters as well, that there are international mechanisms to support technology transfer. The fact that NDCs are conditional on finance and tech transfer should also really make us prioritize this more highly. There are a number of international organizations and development banks that work on tech transfer, providing information and training, project finance, especially for installation and infrastructure, also small scale electricity access. And from my work on these, I've found that they're often quite development focused and there is some local training, but they also predominantly, I would say, are focused on hardware. rather than software and tech transfer. So another way that we could see increased technology transfer is if the obligations under the TRIPS agreement are fulfilled. So in Article 66.2, we see that developed countries are meant to incentivize their firms and institutions to promote tech transfer to LDCs. This is applicable for all technologies, but it also includes low carbon tech. And countries have to submit their reports on Article 66.2 to say what they've done. And I looked into this a bit. Also, colleagues who have written about it say that basically it doesn't necessarily target LDCs. Tech transfer is usually defined very vaguely, and things that are not tech transfer are defined as such. So I guess just to sum up, I think that when we talk about tech transfer and its relationship to development, and as well the intellectual property issue, I think we're talking about several different interconnected and important things all at the same time. And so I wanted to make sort of a systematic way of thinking about what are the problems and how can they be addressed, because some transfer streams, there simply won't be technology transfer occurring through the private sector. So especially in those very high risk markets or very small markets, we won't see the kind of tech transfer that's needed in the very, very short term. And so of course there are international resources. What the international community can do is always increase funding and help out the CTCN in their important work. I also found Dr. Ismail's point about regional cooperation to be very interesting. That's why it's in bold now, and have some very positive impacts to sort of make sure that countries are at least included in tech transfer stream A and B. And as far as national policy options, I think it's possible to use local content requirements, joint ventures, capacity building, but this is a very politically tricky and relatively high risk maneuver. And so there have to be also mechanisms to make sure that this doesn't spur trade conflicts, which obviously make the price of these technologies rise for everyone. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to take up way too much time from you all, but I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Silvia. And I have to apologize because in my haste, I forgot to introduce you properly. Now you have already all learned about Silvia's great expertise on this subject. She is a research associate with the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Germany, where she's working on a large research project around the systemic impacts of the global energy transition. And you have seen her expertise on thinking through how these issues might work in the context of developing countries. So thank you so much, Silvia, and also for being so, giving us the benefit of your research and evidence on what we know about how technology transfer does take place under different circumstances, and also about the options for international cooperation and the existing mechanisms that we can think about using. So I think your presentation was a great one to round out our discussion this morning or this afternoon. And now what I'd like to do, we're running a little behind schedule, but I think you'll all agree that these were really, really rich presentations. So I did not want to interrupt any of them really. But I'm going to turn now, we have three excellent discussants. The first is Joel Richards, who's a senior technical specialist on trade with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. He is a diplomat here in Geneva, where he represents the interests of OECS member states at the WTO, UNCTAD, WIPO, and is really a great force in Geneva for new thinking on these issues. So Joel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone, depending on where in the world you are. And let me commend the previous speakers for very excellent and thorough presentations. And I want to look at the intersection of access to technology, trade, investment, and the domestic policy environment. And I'll try to do that as efficiently as possible. But just to once again say how grateful I am for this opportunity. And I thank the organizers certainly for this visionary effort. And just to underscore that the countries which I represent, which are the member states of the OECS, as Caroline mentioned, like many other small island developing states, we face many challenges to our sustained advancement, including the buffeting effects of climate change, diminishing flows of international aid. And I know a number of the previous speakers spoke about regional and international cooperation, but the context in which we operate at this time is that there are now several obstacles to our ability to, for instance, benefit from concessional approaches to financing with our traditional development partners, which is something we have to think about in the context of access to environmental technologies. And of course, we are affected by rising unemployment and sluggish economic growth, as well as unsustainable debt and aging infrastructure. And so that's really the environment and the framework in which we are looking at issues of technology transfer and access to environmentally friendly technologies. Now, of course, there's also an urgent need for new and relevant sustainable development strategies. That's something that we do recognize, and that's why we place such a great emphasis on the issue of the environment and environmentally sound technologies, because that's important for us to build resilience. And also, when you look at the bottom line of our economic objectives with respect to the triple areas of economic prosperity, social inclusiveness, and environmental sustainability, that then gives you the idea of why this issue is so important for us. Now, in order for us to achieve these triple objectives of economic prosperity and social inclusiveness and environmental sustainability, technology transfer for access to environmental technologies is extremely critical. However, there are several caveats which I want to highlight very quickly. And the first caveat is that for many small island developing states, we generally lack the fiscal space to provide incentives for research and development and for indigenous technology transfer to take place. So you're not going to find a lot of tech transfer taking place between and across firms which are domiciled and which are indigenous to our countries. And that's why generally when we are having these conversations, we're thinking of tech transfer in the context of companies that are coming in to invest, generally from the so-called global north and even from large developing countries, engaging in that kind of activity. The second caveat I want to mention is that for many of our member states, we have non-existent or very underdeveloped ecosystems to foster innovation. And that limits the extent to which we're able to access technologies and also to encourage indigenous technology transfer. And the third has to do with our trade policies and commitments in trade agreements, which do not always align with our broader policy objectives. Now, for example, in some of our bilateral agreements with both the European Union and the United Kingdom, those are economic partnership agreements, we've made several commitments in the areas of investments in environmental services. And some of the sectors and subsectors which we have committed include recycling services, hazardous waste collection and treatment, waste and wastewater management, services incidental to energy, and a few others. There are several members which place no restrictions on market access in these committed sectors. However, there are others which impose restrictions such as requirements for knowledge and technology transfers, outright zero positive intent to allow market access, and there's some that also apply joint venture requirements. Now, in practice, many of our countries are much more liberal than their trade liberalization schedules would suggest. And again, if you look at our WTO schedules or GATS schedules, for example, you'd see that our commitments are very limited in terms of where environmental services, goods and services are concerned, but in practice, we are much more liberal. And I'm saying all of that to say that as developing countries, as small island developing states, we have to see how best we can align what we do with respect to our trade policy or trade agreements with our broader national economic objectives. And the fourth caveat I want to touch on very quickly is that the small size of our markets may not necessarily be attractive to investors from a profit-making perspective. And Silvia did allude to some of these in her presentation as well, some of those dynamics in terms of the extent to which firms coming in, when they're investing, they're looking for certain returns, which our small markets may not always guarantee. And that in and of itself presents an additional problem for us in terms of facilitating greater tech transfers. Now, while trade agreements in and of themselves do not lead to market access or more investment, they do have an important signaling effect to economic operators, because economic operators may look at our schedule and make a judgment call as to whether or not we are open to business in certain areas. And so therefore, from a trade policy perspective, countries have to focus, as I mentioned before, on aligning their policy objectives for promoting access to environmental technologies to their legal commitments in both multilateral and bilateral trade agreements, as well as in our investment treaties. Now, where incentives are concerned, as I stated before, many SIDS tend to lack the fiscal space to offer incentives given existing competition for incentives across sectors. Our levels of indebtedness also do not make these broad approaches to providing incentives, especially tax incentives, very attractive, because we have to think about how does that impact on our debt situation as well. Now, as such, given all that I've said, what we really need is a highly effective participatory approach on the part of the public sector, the civil society, the private sector, including investors, and the international development partners, in terms of, because we cannot necessarily approach this issue of tech transfer on the basis that other countries do. For example, countries are always going to find, companies, sorry, would always find Brazil to be a place that is attractive for them to invest because of the large size of its market. We don't have that luxury, and therefore we need a different kind of approach. Now, I'm getting ready to wrap up, but I also want to touch very quickly, Caroline, on the issue of IP, and that was mentioned by Silvia as well. But just to say, we also have to strike that very careful balance between protecting IP, but also ensuring that we have certain regulations or encouragements in place in our actual policy to encourage tech transfer, but without at the same time disincentivizing companies from coming in, because you want to give investors a certain degree of comfort that we are not flippant with respect to the protection of their intellectual property. And the final issue I'll mention is the issue of our TRIMs, our trade-related investment measures commitments in terms of the WTO context. Because Silvia did a very good job in terms of highlighting some of the typical tech transfer requirements that countries can look at. But when it comes to investments in good sectors, we have pretty much hampered by our TRIMS commitments. And so, so generally, I think these are things we need to revisit. We need a very holistic approach to it. Unfortunately, I don't have all of the answers, but those are some of the challenges that we do face and some of the issues we need to address. So thank you. I'll pause there in the interest of time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joel. I mean, I think you not only set out a lot of challenges, but you did indeed head us on the path to identify, help us identify some of the pathways forward and areas that warrant more consideration. I am not doing my best job at moderating today because I hope that the speakers can see some of the questions in the chat and also try and respond to some of those. I feel that all the speakers are starting to answer the questions also as we go forward. So I'm not so concerned about not having the discussion time. I think what's most important is we hear these excellent presentations that people have prepared. So I'm now going to turn to Nimalia Siam, who is from the South Center, where he is the program director and leads their work on intellectual property on a number of issues. He works at a place that has tremendous expertise on IP and sustainable development issues. Nimalia, just before you start, I would just ask you to try and keep to the 5 minutes so we also have time for Tony after you. So thank you so much, Nimalia, for joining us.
Thank you, Caroline, and it's a pleasure to join you here, and thank you for the kind invitation to the South Center. Very briefly, when we were going through these very interesting and rich presentations, I was asking myself actually, when was the last time we met in Geneva? At least I met in a forum in Geneva to discuss this issue. And my mind went back to actually quite a few summers back. It was around 2014-15 when, or 2013-14, when Ecuador had submitted a proposal at the TRIPS Council on this specific subject, calling for clarification of the provisions of the TRIPS agreement and the nature of, say, a Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health, stating that nothing in the agreement should be interpreted in a way as to create obstacles towards taking measures for in relation to IPRs, in relation to environmentally sound technologies. It's been quite a few years since then. And today, during our discussions, also, until Silvia brought up the issue of IPR, the question that constantly popped up in my mind is, I remember around 2011 to 2014 in the UNFCCC as well, there were intense debates on technology transfer. And one of the major points of the discussions at that point of time was on how to address the issue of IPRs. And the question now in the context of technology needs assessment reports, where developing countries who have submitted TNA reports are demonstrating the importance of climate-friendly technologies that they need, the challenges that they face. A question that I would like to put out here is whether intellectual property has been identified in those contexts as specific challenges, or are those applicable in different technology contexts or not? So perhaps the experts could elaborate on that aspect as well. The other question that also came up to my mind, and Mr. Garg also pointed this out in his presentation, that one of the challenges many countries have is identifying what are the relevant technologies for them. And I was thinking that here in Geneva for many years, in WIPO particularly, we have been talking about, we have been hearing about WIPO Green, the WIPO development agenda implementation. Again, in that context, Professor Caroline is an expert on that as well. And she knows very well that in the development agenda projects, perhaps we have not actually seen any specific initiative in the context of climate-friendly technologies either. So, so perhaps those are important pointers that we could take home to see how we could explore those further. The other issue, specifically in the context of WTO, that I could point out is that there is a working group on trade and transfer of technology, which exists in the WTO. It has actually not met as frequently as one would wish. The meetings have been less frequent over the last couple of years, particularly. I think it has hardly met in the last year. The discussions have sort of become inane, and perhaps there is scope for thinking whether in the context of the working group on trade and transfer of technologies, whose mandate was to actually identify technology transfer related issues emanating from the various WTO agreements, to look at specifically in the and particularly drawing from, say, paragraph 31 of the Doha Declaration of 2001, to look at environmentally sound technologies and how those could be addressed in the context of the working group on trade and transfer of technology. Another, perhaps sort of, I'm thinking out loud here, issue that we could look at, and this is again reacting to the possible increase in use of trade disputes to challenge measures taken by countries for access to climate-friendly technologies. I'm referring here to the US-China dispute. Is whether there could be the possibility of exploring a moratorium on WTO disputes, specifically in the context of climate-friendly technologies across the board. I fully agree with what Silvia also mentioned about Article 66.2 and the lack of effective reporting therein, and perhaps that's another aspect that we could also take forward in terms of addressing specifically. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nimalia. I'm just going to swift directly to Tony Taubman, who is the Director of Intellectual Property Division at the World Trade Organization. Thank you, Tony. Try and keep to your 5 minutes if possible. It has to be possible. You have the floor.
Lost the mute button, of course. After 2 years, I'm still losing it. Excuse me. So thank you very much indeed, Carolyn, and tremendous initiative. I'd like to spend my 5 minutes responding to the great ideas put forward and commending the initiative, but I'll try to be a bit more disciplined. I wouldn't be doing my job, however, if I didn't mention the broader work done in the WTO that many have already referred to. In particular on trade and environment issues more generally. This is not my immediate purview, it's the Trade and Environment Division, or TED as we call it. So if you want a real TED talk, you need to rope in my colleagues, in particular Ho Lim, who is even a better speaker than I am. But I should mention that there is of course a real upsurge of work on trade and environment broadly, a lot of interest both at the technical level and at the political level, and much hope, I think, for convergence in that direction. Even focusing just on the technology transfer aspect. Indeed, as has just been mentioned, the working group there could certainly be revitalized, but also more broadly, looking at the if you like, the conventional trade policy settings. I think technology transfer is part of the conversation about the value of facilitating trade in environmental goods and services, and the potentially self-defeating impact of restrictions on trade in those areas. In terms of inputs for green technology, key technologies themselves and technology platforms, and also services, which we've touched on a little in terms of investment, but also trade in services, remembering that there is a human dimension to technology transfer. We've heard of the hardware and the software. There's also the wetware, as you can call it, or the human capital, which is an integral part of the technology flows that Silvia has so superbly characterized. But I'm going to just zero in very quickly on some of the immediate TRIPS issues that have been mentioned. Firstly, I would say that indeed, thank you, Normally, for mentioning the proposal by Ecuador in the TRIPS Council. And this hasn't led to agreement, an outcome. It's not something we're particularly good at in the TRIPS Council, but what I would say is that it has led to an extremely interesting array of domestic policies and initiatives for green innovation, for climate technology innovation and diffusion, which I think is unique in terms of very specific IP-related measures taken by governments and reported on by governments in a multilateral forum, on the record. And I won't even touch on those into detail now, but just to mention, we do have resources drawing on that material and also setting out the wider TRIPS issues that have been well discussed already, and happy to refer to those. But what I'd like, just one simple thing I'd like to do is to take up some of the conversation about 66.2, because that's the specific TRIPS measure relating to technology transfer expressly, and of course for those countries in greatest need of technology transfer across the board, but also in this area in particular. And I think everyone knows the basic elements of this provision, so I won't review that. I do acknowledge that there is indeed a debate about both its legal focus, its legal characteristics, what it is to have an initiative in this context, incentive in this context, but also the focus and the accuracy of the reporting. That said, there is a huge amount of reporting of measures following a ministerial decision that we should have an improved reporting mechanism in this regard. And also to respond to the concern, I think legitimate concern, that measures that have not been effectively focused on the specific needs of LDCs and tailored for LDCs as such. As part of the process of improving the dialogue on this, we have undertaken a recent survey of environment technology needs, guided by, of course, experts in environmental technology. And this has led to an interesting pattern of needs expressed by LDCs for technology transfer, recalling that the TRIPS provision is to reach a sound and viable technological base. So that goes into quite some significance in terms of not only, if you like, a shopping list, but in terms of a longer strategic development outlook, building a technological base rather than simply acquiring technology off the shelf, as it were. Of the programs reported relating to environmental and climate technologies, this is literally a snapshot of the programs reported in recent years, in recent rounds of reports, reaching 41 LDC recipients, and just a glimpse of the geographical range of those that are reported, but also a breakdown according to the environmental or green technology sector that is relevant. And this has now been broken down in more detail, mapping across to some extent to the needs matrix that has been identified. The reports are indeed lengthy, and we are working to make them more accessible and more systematic, more regular, structured, and therefore more easily focused on the specific needs identified by LDCs. But here's again just a snapshot of the range of recent reports that are in this wide range of material. But above all, this won't work well, even an improved mechanism, if it's operating in isolation. And to my mind, the next step is to integrate this, as well as the broader debate, by the way, about trade and environment, trade and access to environmental technologies, to the much more authoritative and deeply rooted work of the CTCN, the technology needs assessments, and of course the NDCs notified by the countries themselves, which is of course the definitive grassroots guidance on the kind of technologies that need to be prioritized, because only then can we shape the specific measures, but also broader dialogue and let's hope agreements on concrete outcomes. Only then can it be shaped in a way that really responds to the actual needs identified by those countries looking to leverage greater access to necessary environmentally and climate technologies. I hope that's my 5 minutes. I would love to go on, and this whole session has been gathering momentum. It's very exciting, and I hope at least that it's whet the appetite of all involved to take it a lot further and in a more intensive way, because there's certainly been if you like, a proof of concept today, and it'd be tremendous to take this further and deeper, if at all possible. And I can certainly say on behalf of my colleagues in the Secretariat, who I should acknowledge, Xiaoping, Alex, and Jessica, who've done the hard work here, there's an enormous appetite across the Secretariat to engage in this kind of work, so that our members do have a much stronger, richer, better grounded empirical base to work from in these very, very important, critically important conversations, and let's hope outcomes. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tony. And thank you also for your endorsement of this event as having been useful. I'm very conscious that we're running out of time, and thank you, Tony. You didn't take more time than you needed. We all just took a little more. So what I would propose, if everyone is willing, is just to take a quick 10 more minutes for those who can stay. For those who can't, ideally apologize for being too fascinated by the subject matter to be more disciplined. And so do thank you if you have to leave. But I would like to take 10 minutes, if we can, just to offer each of the speakers a chance to reflect a little, as Tony has, on what they see as some key points, what they've learned from this discussion, or where to next. Certainly from the point of view of TESS, we're really excited to have been able to reinvigorate or revive this discussion today. There's been a huge range of policy issues put on the table. from IP related ones to climate waivers, domestic policies, regional work, also issues of environmental goods and services trade and how that fits in. So there's much to be discussed. And I think that we have a really some rich prospects going forward. Certainly my colleague, Christoph Bellman, who's leading our work on climate and trade and organized this, we intend to look at ways to go forward. So please, for those of you who are listening and speaking, if you think of ideas of how best to take forward the richness of this discussion, we'd be pleased to work with you or support your work on that. But quickly, if I can, I'd just like to ask all of our speakers from the top just to take a minute to say what it is that they have found most useful and moving forward, or particular points that they loved. But you literally have a minute each to do so. So I'll start with Rajiv.
Yeah, thank you. Means I think this kind of discussion, specifically on IP rights related to technology, is very important. We have been grappling with this issue for a pretty long time in the climate COP, but really at a ground level, the CTCN experience of working in 108 countries and large focus on LDCs and states, we really see, means the IP issues come into picture when you start going into manufacturing aspect of the technology. And to do that, you have to have a sizable market. So the first thing is that what kind of market you have in a country, what is the scale of market, whether it would really require a manufacturing setup to be established for supply of hardware or technologies, or it is much more cheaper to import the goods. The main issue what we saw is the application of technology rather than manufacturing of the technology, and how to apply it, where to apply it, how to maintain it. That is a larger issue, specifically with in developing countries which have small markets. On the IP side, we are very actively collaborating with WIPO, but so far we have not really grappled with an issue or a technical assistance wherein an IP has become a kind of a barrier for implementation of a technology, or a barrier for implementation of any enabling environment to promote technology.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Rajiv. Faisal, are you still with us? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I really also enjoyed the discussion, and it stimulated my mind about a number of issues. I think that, the most critical thing that we all have to grapple with is that we have just experienced or experiencing the pandemic. And what this has done is, can you see me? Yeah.
Yeah.
What this pandemic has done, it has put to the front the systemic nature of the crisis in health. Well, this climate change crisis is even bigger than health. And just, last week in Durban and all on the coast, on the east coast of the southern east coast of Africa, just in a matter of a few days, 450 people were killed by the floods, and hundreds of schools, and billions of rands of damage in infrastructure. So this is much greater. The impact of climate change is much more devastating. And what when I was reading a little bit, I didn't read thousands of pages of the IPCC report, you just get terrified about not just how massive the damage could be, but how near it is. As global warming takes place. So I think that we need to have a rethink about global governance. Intellectual property rights, we've had to rethink a little bit. We didn't quite get there on health. But in climate change, we have to rethink it, the concept of intellectual property, and whether we continue to give such big monopoly rights to the private sector. The public sector, and particularly the global public sector, needs to take this on board and see how it can invest in it as a public good for society as a whole to address such an important risk. So a lot of rethinking, and so I encourage you to continue with the series you've started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faisal. Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you from my side as well. Also, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next. I think for me, one of the main points that I keep running into is like how important it is to differentiate between access and transfer, right? Because like there is a massive technology access problem that has to do with finance. And then to differentiate between this, when we start talking about intellectual property rights and this being much more about competitive advantages and the wish for green industrialization and all of these different things. And I'm not saying that this is a wrong wish or a bad thing, but I think it's important to keep these things somewhat distinct, to be able to focus on like what's needed for different people in different places. And I think also this is going to, as Dr. Ismail also suggested, this is going to become an increasing problem, not only because of climate change, but also because we're going to start tracking emissions in trade. And I think for everybody who works on trade issues now, like the EU's CBAM is going to be a big thing. So there may be a double impact of not decarbonizing and not having access to these technologies. So it's even more important to really address this massive need through every single way that we have. But yeah, I hope that we can keep talking about these issues in the future. Thanks.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. But with the permission of the three discussants, I think we might leave the comments just with the three main speakers so that we can wrap up in time. But I really wanted to thank you all for a fantastic discussion. We've taken note of all of the questions. I can assure you we will find a way of taking this discussion forward again. I think that what we've really seen today is there's a great deal of evidence, experience, and interest, that can be harnessed to really better understand the priorities for technology access and transfer, helping us understand what this means and what this requires from a policy, regulatory, and sort of financing perspective, and also what works or not. I think the key thing, I think Faisal's presentation really helped us underline we need to think about this in the context of climate resilient development. And of course, Rajiv's opening one is we also have to think about in the context of these key climate mitigation and adaptation goals. What are we trying to achieve as a global community, and where does technology fit into that? I think today we achieved our goal of looking at trade, how trade policies and trade incentives are relevant to the issue of environmental technologies and access and transfer. We've also heard some really specific ideas about mechanisms at the WTO and processes that we could use to enrich in this discussion. We spent quite a lot of time at the end around issues of intellectual property, but I think the discussion as a whole looked at a wider range of policy tools as well. Underlying there is this issue of just trade in environmental technologies, and also what trade policy package is useful to facilitate and promote that trade, but in ways that not only supports access, but also uptake and use. And as Silvia said, this whole idea of also trying to build industrial capacity and competitiveness in these sectors as well. So I don't think I'm going to try and go any further in summarizing what was such a rich discussion. But I'd just like to close again by thanking you all for taking the time to be here. And we really look forward to taking this discussion forward. So thank you to Joel, to Tony, and to Malia, Faisal, Silvia, and Rajiv for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to join you.